In the quiet shadows of deep time, long before empires rose and fell, before the written word captured human ambition, there existed a chain of volcanic islands floating in the vast Pacific. These islands, born from fire and fury beneath the ocean's surface, would become the cradle of one of history's most enduring civilizations. Picture, if you will, a world 16,000 years ago when ice still gripped the northern hemisphere and the sea levels lay dramatically lower than today. The Japanese archipelago, as we know it, did not yet exist in its current form. Instead, land bridges connected these volcanic peaks to the Asian mainland, creating pathways for migration for life, for the first whispers of what would become Japan. The story of ancient Japan begins not with emperors or warriors, but with stone and survival. Around 14,000 years before the Common Era, as the last ice age slowly released its frozen grip on the world, small bands of hunter-gatherers crossed these land bridges from Siberia, from the Korean peninsula, from territories we can now barely imagine. They came following game, following seasons, following the eternal human impulse to discover what lies beyond the horizon. These were the Jomon people, named for the distinctive rope patterns they pressed into their clay pottery, and they would inhabit these islands for an astonishing 10,000 years, creating what archaeologists now recognize as one of the world's earliest pottery-making cultures. The Jomon period, spanning from roughly 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE, represents a chapter of human history that defies simple categorization. While other regions of the world rushed toward agriculture and urbanization, the Jomon people perfected a different path. They were not farmers in the traditional sense, yet neither were they simple nomads. Instead, they developed what we might call a sophisticated hunter-gatherer society, one that understood the rhythms of nature with such intimacy that they could live in semi-permanent settlements, returning year after year to the same locations as seasons cycled and resources renewed themselves. Their villages dotted the coastlines and river valleys, clusters of pit houses dug into the earth, warm in winter, cool in summer. The land itself shaped everything. Japan's volcanic geology meant fertile soil, yes, but also earthquakes that could swallow villages in moments, tsunamis that could erase generations of accumulated wisdom. The mountains, covering 70% of the archipelago, created isolated valleys where communities developed their own dialects, their own customs, their own ways of understanding the world. And everywhere, always, the forest pressed close, dense with cedar and cypress, alive with deer and wild boar, mysterious with spirits that seemed to dwell in every ancient tree and moss-covered stone. What sustained the Jomon was abundance. The surrounding seas teemed with fish, the forests offered chestnuts and acorns, the rivers ran with salmon during spawning season. They developed tools of remarkable sophistication: fishhooks carved from bone, harpoons for hunting sea mammals, elaborate lacquerware that speaks to an aesthetic sensibility we might not expect from a Stone Age culture. Their pottery evolved over millennia, from simple vessels to objects of such artistic complexity that they challenge our assumptions about prehistoric life. These were people who had time not just to survive, but to create beauty, to contemplate the nature of existence, to begin formulating the spiritual worldview that would eventually become Shinto, the way of the gods. Yet beneath this apparent timelessness, change was approaching. To the west, across the Korean Strait, great civilizations rose and fell. China developed writing, bronze casting, complex state structures. Korea served as a bridge between continental developments and the isolated islands. And slowly, inexorably, new ideas, new technologies, new people began making their way across the water. The Jomon way of life, which had endured for 10,000 years, was about to encounter forces that would transform it utterly. The stage was set for the next great chapter in Japan's story, one that would bring agriculture, metallurgy, and the first stirrings of political organization to these volcanic shores. As the centuries unfolded like pages in an ancient scroll, the character of the Japanese islands began to shift in ways both subtle and profound. Around 300 BCE, new waves of migrants arrived from the Korean peninsula, bringing with them knowledge that would revolutionize life on the archipelago. These newcomers, whom historians call the Yayoi people, named for the Tokyo district where their distinctive pottery was first discovered, carried seeds of rice and the techniques for cultivating it in flooded paddies. They brought bronze and iron, metals that could be shaped into tools far more efficient than stone, into weapons that could decide the fate of communities. And perhaps most significantly, they brought a different social organization, one based not on small egalitarian bands of hunter-gatherers, but on hierarchical agricultural societies capable of accumulating wealth, establishing permanent territories, and projecting power. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it uniformly violent, though certainly conflict arose between old ways and new. Rather, what occurred over the next several centuries was a complex process of cultural blending, a slow dance between the indigenous Jomon and the immigrant Yayoi. In some regions, Jomon communities adopted rice cultivation while maintaining their traditional spiritual practices and artistic traditions. In others, Yayoi settlements simply displaced or absorbed the older population. Genetic evidence suggests that modern Japanese people descend from both groups, their bloodlines mingling across generations until the distinction between native and newcomer became meaningless. What emerged was something new, a synthesis that would form the foundation of Japanese civilization. Rice cultivation changed everything. Unlike the Jomon's dependence on wild resources, rice farming required coordination, collective labor, sophisticated irrigation systems. A community that successfully managed its rice paddies could support a larger population, could accumulate surplus grain, could sustain non-farming specialists like craftsmen and warriors. Wealth became storable, inheritable, worth fighting over. Archaeological evidence from the Yayoi period shows increasing signs of warfare, fortified settlements surrounded by moats and wooden palisades, mass graves containing bodies bearing wounds from bronze weapons. Power began to concentrate in the hands of those who controlled the most productive farmland, and from this concentration emerged the first proto-states, regional confederations bound together by kinship, alliance, and mutual defense. But material culture tells only part of this story. The spiritual landscape was evolving as well, drawing on currents that flowed from the great civilizations of mainland Asia. Chinese culture, at its zenith during the Han Dynasty, exerted an enormous gravitational pull on its neighbors. Korean kingdoms served as conduits for Chinese innovations, not merely passing them along, but adapting and reinterpreting them for new contexts. Japanese society, emerging from its long isolation, began to drink deeply from this well of continental learning. Chinese bronze mirrors, treasured as sacred objects, found their way into the burials of Yayoi elites. Chinese coins circulated as exotic imports, symbols of connection to a wider world. Yet even as these foreign influences washed over the islands, something distinctly Japanese was crystallizing. The indigenous reverence for nature, the sense that divine spirits, or kami, inhabited sacred places, mountains, waterfalls, ancient trees. This worldview persisted and deepened. It would eventually be codified as Shinto, the way of the gods, but in these early centuries it remained fluid, personal, local. Each community had its tutelary deity, its sacred grove, its seasonal festivals marking the cycles of planting and harvest. The boundaries between the human and divine, the natural and supernatural, remained permeable, intimate. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, Chinese chronicles begin to mention the islands they called Wa, noting the existence of numerous small kingdoms engaged in constant diplomacy and occasional warfare. One account, the Wager, describes a particularly powerful female ruler named Himiko, a shaman queen who lived in seclusion, interpreting the will of the gods for her people. sending embassies to the Chinese court to establish tributary relations that brought prestige and exotic goods. Whether Himiko was a single historical figure or a composite of several rulers, her story suggests a society in transition, where political and spiritual authority remained intertwined, where the old shamanic traditions of the Yomon coexisted with the new hierarchies of the Yayoi. The stage was set for the next great transformation. The isolated islands had become connected to continental developments, had absorbed new technologies and ideas while maintaining their unique character. The family of Japanese civilization had claimed its heritage, drawing from indigenous roots and foreign influences alike. And now, as political units grew larger and more sophisticated, as cultural borrowing accelerated and intensified, Japan stood on the threshold of becoming something unprecedented, a synthesis of native and foreign, ancient and modern, that would define its character for centuries to come. As one chapter closed, another, more turbulent, began to unfold across the Japanese archipelago. The 4th century of the Common Era witnessed a remarkable consolidation of power, a process that archaeologists recognize through a sudden transformation in the landscape itself. Enormous burial mounds began to appear, keyhole-shaped tombs so massive that their construction must have required the coordinated labor of thousands. These kofun, as they came to be called, gave their name to an entire era, the Kofun period, spanning roughly from 250 to 538 CE. They were monuments to ambition, statements carved into the earth itself, declaring that the age of small competing chiefdoms was giving way to something far grander. The largest of these burial mounds, the tomb of Emperor Nintoku near modern-day Osaka, stretches nearly 500 meters in length, surrounded by 3 moats, containing more earth than the Great Pyramid of Giza. To stand before such a structure, even today, is to feel the weight of organized power. To understand viscerally that whoever commanded its construction wielded authority of an entirely different order than the village chiefs of earlier times. Inside these tombs, archaeologists have found treasures that speak to sophisticated networks of trade and tribute, Chinese bronze mirrors, Korean gold jewelry, locally crafted iron weapons and armor, clay cylinders called haniwa that once ringed the mounds, depicting warriors, horses, houses, and servants, a terracotta army to serve the deceased in the afterlife. What was emerging during these centuries was the Yamato state, named for the region in central Honshu where its power first coalesced. The Yamato rulers claimed descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, a divine lineage that set them apart from rival clans and justified their expanding hegemony. This was more than mere political propaganda. It represented a fundamental shift in how power was understood and legitimized. No longer did authority rest solely on military might or control of productive farmland. Now it flowed from cosmic sources, from the very gods who had created the islands and set the sun in motion. The Yamato sovereigns were not simply the strongest chiefs. They were sacred beings, intermediaries between heaven and earth. And this sacred character would define Japanese imperial ideology for centuries to come. Yet the Yamato state remained, in these early centuries, more a confederation than a centralized empire. The great clans, the Uji, retained considerable autonomy within their territories, acknowledging Yamato supremacy while jealously guarding their own prerogatives. The Soga clan controlled access to immigrant Korean craftsmen and scribes. The Mononobe clan commanded military forces and supervised Shinto rituals. The Nakatomi clan provided priests for court ceremonies. Power was distributed, balanced, constantly negotiated through marriage alliances, gift exchanges, and the careful choreography of precedents at court. This was a political system still finding its form, still learning to translate the loose authority of a paramount chief into the structured hierarchy of a state. Meanwhile, forces beyond anyone's control were gathering across the Korean Strait. The peninsula remained divided among 3 kingdoms, Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, Silla in the southeast, locked in perpetual competition for territory and supremacy. Japan maintained close ties with Baekje, sending troops to support their allies, absorbing waves of Korean refugees when fortunes of war turned against them. These immigrants brought in valuable skills: literacy, metallurgy, textile production, diplomatic protocols learned at Chinese courts. They served as cultural translators, introducing the Yamato elite to the sophisticated civilization that flourished on the continent, making Japanese rulers increasingly aware of how provincial, how unlettered, their own society appeared by comparison. The awakening came gradually, then suddenly. Japanese envoys who traveled to Korean courts and occasionally to China itself returned with tales of cities containing hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, of governments administered through written documents, of philosophical traditions that grappled with questions of ethics and cosmic order, of Buddhist monasteries where monks devoted their lives to transcending suffering and achieving enlightenment. These reports must have seemed almost fantastical to a society that still transmitted knowledge orally, that built with wood rather than stone, that organized itself through personal relationships rather than bureaucratic structures. Yet they also represented an irresistible vision of possibility, a glimpse of what Japanese civilization might become if it could master the learning of the continent. The youth of Japanese civilization was ending. The simple confidence of isolated development was giving way to a more complex awareness, a recognition that the archipelago existed not in splendid isolation, but as part of a larger cultural sphere dominated by China's overwhelming sophistication. This realization was simultaneously humbling and energizing. It required acknowledging current limitations while kindling ambition for transformation. The stage was set for a revolution in Japanese culture, not imposed by conquest, but chosen through deliberate cultural borrowing, a conscious decision to remake society according to continental models, while somehow preserving what was uniquely, essentially, Japanese. The education of a civilization was about to begin in earnest. The moment that changed everything arrived in the year 552 or perhaps 538, the sources disagree, brought not by armies, but by ambassadors. A delegation from the Korean kingdom of Baekje arrived at the Yamato court bearing gifts of unusual character: bronze statues of the Buddha, sutras written in Chinese characters, and a letter explaining this foreign teaching. Buddhism, the delegation explained, was a path to enlightenment, a system for understanding suffering and transcending it, a tradition already centuries old that had transformed China and was reshaping Korea. The Yamato sovereign, Emperor Kinmei, found himself confronting a choice that would reverberate through generations. Should Japan embrace this foreign religion or reject it as a threat to the native kami worship? The question split the court. The Soga clan, whose power derived partly from managing foreign relations and immigrant communities, championed Buddhism enthusiastically, seeing in it both spiritual truth and political advantage. Sophisticated continental religion would elevate Japan's standing, they argued, would connect the court to wider networks of learning and diplomacy. The Mononobe and Nakatomi clans, guardians of traditional Shinto practices, opposed the new teaching as dangerous pollution that would anger the native gods. When an epidemic swept through the capital, they seized upon it as proof that the kami were offended by foreign deities. They cast the Buddha statue into a canal and burned the temple that had been built to house it. But history, as it often does, had other plans. The Soga clan's influence continued to grow, reaching its zenith under Soga no Umako, who became the de facto power behind the throne. When tensions erupted into open conflict in 587, Umako's forces defeated the Mononobe clan in battle, eliminating the primary opposition to Buddhism and foreign learning. The new religion was here to stay, though not as a replacement for Shinto, but as a complement to it, creating the distinctive religious synthesis that would characterize Japanese spirituality. The native kami would continue to receive reverence as guardians of the land and lineage, while Buddhist philosophy offered answers to questions about death, karma, and the nature of existence that Shinto had never addressed. With Buddhism came a flood of continental learning. Buddhist sutras required literacy, and literacy required adopting Chinese characters, a system developed for a completely different language, but adapted with considerable difficulty to express Japanese. This was no simple task. Chinese is monosyllabic and tonal, Japanese is polysyllabic and non-tonal. Chinese characters represent both meaning and sound, but which sound system to use when reading them in Japanese? The solutions that emerged were complex, multiple reading systems coexisting, Chinese characters used sometimes for their meaning, sometimes for their sound, sometimes both simultaneously. Yet this very complexity proved generative, forcing Japanese scholars to think deeply about language itself, creating a rich literary culture that would eventually produce works of stunning sophistication. The young Prince Shotoku, serving as regent for his aunt Empress Suiko from 593 to 622, embodied this new orientation toward continental learning. Tradition credits him with remarkable achievements, though historians debate how many were truly his work versus later attributions. He supposedly authored commentaries on Buddhist sutras, established temples including the magnificent Horyuji, and promulgated a 17-article constitution that articulated Chinese-influenced principles of government. Whether or not he personally wrote all these texts matters less than what they represent, a conscious effort to remake Japanese institutions according to continental models, to transform the Yamato state from a loose confederation into a Chinese-style centralized bureaucracy. The constitution attributed to Shotoku reveals this ambition clearly. Harmony is to be valued, it begins, invoking Confucian ideals, and opposition for opposition's sake is to be avoided. It instructs officials to revere Buddhism, to obey imperial commands promptly, to make decisions collectively rather than individually. It assumes a world where written edicts carry authority across distances, where officials are selected for merit rather than birth, where law, rather than personal relationship, governs administration. This was aspiration more than reality, a vision of what Japan might become rather than description of what it was. But aspiration has power. It provides direction, measures progress, justifies transformation. Meanwhile, official embassies began traveling directly to China, no longer relying on Korean intermediaries. The Sui dynasty, which briefly reunified China after centuries of division, received Japanese envoys who observed court ceremonies, purchased books, recruited scholars and monks willing to cross the ocean and serve foreign patrons. When the Sui gave way to the Tang dynasty in 618, these missions continued and intensified. The Tang capital of Chang'an was the largest city in the world, a cosmopolitan metropolis of 1 million inhabitants, where merchants from Central Asia rubbed shoulders with monks from India, where poetry and painting reached heights of refinement that dazzled visitors from less sophisticated societies. Japanese students spent years there, decades sometimes, absorbing everything they could before returning home, laden with books, artifacts, and transformative ideas. This was Japan's training period, its deliberate apprenticeship to continental civilization. The islands were drinking deeply from Chinese wells, studying Tang administrative codes, Buddhist philosophical texts, Confucian classics, poetic conventions, architectural principles, urban planning, calendar making, musical theory. It was cultural borrowing on a scale rarely seen in history, a wholesale importation of foreign learning motivated not by conquest but by choice, by recognition that Japan's isolation had left it culturally impoverished compared to its neighbors. Yet even as they studied continental models with intense dedication, Japanese scholars never entirely lost sight of their own traditions, never completely abandoned the sense that there was something uniquely valuable in their native customs. The challenge would be synthesizing these two streams, foreign sophistication and native authenticity, into something new, something distinctly Japanese. On a day like any other, yet destined to be remembered, in the 6th month of the year 645, violence erupted within the sacred precincts of the imperial palace. Prince Naka no Oe, grandson of the powerful Soga no Umako, had grown weary of his family's stranglehold on power. The Soga clan had become too mighty, too presumptuous, treating emperors as puppets and making decisions that should have been imperial prerogatives. In a carefully orchestrated coup, the prince and his ally Nakatomi no Kamatari confronted Soga no Iruka during a court ceremony, assassinating him before the shocked assembly of nobles. Iruka's father, hearing of his son's death, took his own life. The Soga clan's dominance, which had shaped Japanese politics for decades, ended in blood and fire. This was more than dynastic intrigue. It was revolution, the forceful clearing away of old structures to make space for radical transformation. Prince Naka no Oe, who would eventually ascend the throne as Emperor Tenji, understood that Japan's future required more than piecemeal adoption of continental practices. What was needed was systematic, comprehensive reform, a complete reimagining of how the state functioned. Within months of the coup, edicts began flowing from the palace, collectively known as the Taika Reforms, taking their name from the new era, name proclaimed to mark this watershed moment. Great change, the characters meant, and change there would be on a scale that would reshape Japanese society from its foundations. The reforms struck at the heart of the old order. All land, the edicts proclaimed, now belonged to the emperor, not to the great clans who had controlled it for generations. The Uji system, where powerful families held hereditary dominion over territories and populations, was to be dismantled. In its place would rise a Chinese-style system where the state allocated land to peasant cultivators, who would work it in exchange for paying taxes directly to the central government. Officials would no longer inherit their positions through clan membership, but would be appointed based on merit and could be transferred or dismissed at imperial pleasure. Provincial governors answerable to the capital would replace autonomous local strongmen. Power, in theory at least, would flow from the emperor downward through a hierarchical bureaucracy modeled explicitly on Tang China's sophisticated administrative apparatus. Yet beneath this apparent triumph, seeds of resistance were already taking root. The great clans had not accumulated centuries of wealth and influence only to surrender it because of royal proclamations. They adapted, outwardly accepting the reforms while quietly subverting their implementation. Land that was supposed to revert to imperial control somehow remained under clan management. Positions in the new bureaucracy mysteriously went to the same families who had dominated under the old system. The Chinese examination system, which in theory should have allowed talented commoners to rise through demonstrated knowledge of the classics, never quite took hold in Japan, where aristocratic birth continued to trump learning. The reforms represented aspiration more than achievement, a statement of intent that would take centuries to realize fully, and even then never quite as thoroughly as reformers hoped. Still, transformation was unmistakable. A new capital city, Fujiwara-kyo, rose in the Yamato Plain, laid out in a grid pattern mimicking Chang'an, the Tang capital. For the first time, Japan had a permanent seat of government rather than courts that moved with each new sovereign. Administrative codes, the Omi Code and later the more comprehensive Taiho Code, were compiled, attempting to regulate everything from court ceremonies to criminal punishment, from tax collection to religious observances. These codes filled volumes, borrowed heavily from Tang precedents, but adapted to Japanese circumstances, creating legal infrastructure for a centralized state. A new aristocratic ranking system with 8 grades distinguished by the color of caps worn at court replaced the old clan hierarchies with bureaucratic hierarchy. The religious landscape shifted as well. Buddhism, already influential, now received active state sponsorship. Temples were constructed in every province, serving not merely as places of worship, but as instruments of cultural transformation and social control. Monks copied sutras, performed rituals for the state's protection, and taught literacy and continental learning. The great temples in the capital became centers of political influence, their abbots wielding power comparable to high government ministers. Yet Shinto endured, woven into the fabric of imperial legitimacy itself. The emperor remained the descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, his authority ultimately divine rather than bureaucratic. Grand shrines at Ise and Izumo received rich support, their festivals marking the ritual calendar. Perhaps most significant was the psychological transformation. Japan had been provincial, peripheral, aware of its own backwardness compared to the sophisticated civilizations of the continent. The Taika reforms represented a declaration that this era had ended, that Japan could master continental learning and create institutions as sophisticated as any in East Asia. It was an assertion of cultural ambition, a refusal to remain forever in China's shadow. The archipelago was rising, not through military conquest, but through deliberate cultural construction, building a civilization that borrowed freely from abroad while maintaining distinctive character. This was Japan's breakthrough moment, when aspiration crystallized into institutional form, when the future toward which the nation had been groping suddenly seemed achievable, tangible, within reach. The foundations had been laid. Now came the hard work of building upon them. Time, as it often does, revealed both the promise and limitations of radical reform. The decades following the Taika coup saw successive emperors and their ministers laboring to translate grand proclamations into functional reality. It was one thing to decree a new order from the palace, quite another to make it work across hundreds of miles of mountainous terrain. In provinces where power had always belonged to local strongmen who saw no reason to surrender it to distant bureaucrats, the Chinese model that inspired the reforms assumed a relatively flat, densely populated landscape connected by navigable rivers and ancient roads. Japan offered mountains separating narrow valleys, limited arable land, communities isolated by geography, and centuries of autonomous development. Continental blueprints required constant adaptation, creative reinterpretation, sometimes wholesale abandonment when they proved unworkable. The capital itself became a laboratory for cultural transformation. In 710, the court relocated from Fujiwara-kyo to a new, even more ambitious site, Heijo-kyo, better known as Nara. This was not mere relocation, but architectural manifesto. Nara was designed to be a miniature Chang'an, a capital worthy of a civilized state, with broad avenues dividing the city into regular blocks. Government ministries housed in imposing tile-roofed structures, markets regulated by official inspectors, and at the northern end, the imperial palace compound, its vermilion pillars and white walls gleaming above the city. For 75 years, from 710 to 784, Nara served as the fixed capital, and these decades witnessed an extraordinary flowering of continental-inspired culture, an era when Japanese civilization seemed to be successfully absorbing and replicating the sophistication of Tang China. Buddhism reached its zenith of institutional power during the Nara period. The Emperor Shomu, reigning from 724 to 749, became Buddhism's greatest imperial patron, pouring resources into temple construction on a scale that strained the treasury. His masterwork, the Todaiji Temple, housed a colossal bronze Buddha, the Daibutsu, standing 16 meters tall, requiring repeated castings and years of labor to complete. When it was finally consecrated in 752 in a ceremony attended by thousands, it seemed to proclaim Japan's arrival as a Buddhist nation equal to any on the continent. The major temples, the 7 great temples of Nara, became landholders of vast estates, taxpayers who owed allegiance to imperial authority but wielded considerable autonomy. Monks and scholars from across East Asia gathered in Nara's monasteries, creating communities where Sanskrit, Chinese, and Japanese mingled, where philosophical debates raged late into the night, where libraries accumulated texts from India, China, and Korea. Yet beneath this apparent Buddhist triumph, tensions simmered. The temples grew too wealthy, too politically involved, their abbots too willing to involve themselves in court intrigues and succession disputes. Monks, supposedly devoted to transcending worldly attachments, seemed remarkably attached to institutional power and economic privilege. The most controversial figure was Dokyo, a monk who became the favorite and possibly lover of the widowed Empress Kokin. Dokyo accumulated titles and influence until he effectively controlled the government, and rumors swirled that he intended to usurp the throne itself, to replace the sacred imperial lineage with his own rule. Whether these rumors were true or court propaganda from his enemies, they revealed deep anxieties about Buddhism's place in Japanese society. When Empress Kokin died in 770, Dokyo was swiftly exiled, and the court resolved that never again would a woman rule as sovereign in her own right, a decision that would shape Japanese history for more than a millennium. Meanwhile, Chinese influence permeated every aspect of elite culture. Japanese aristocrats studied Chinese classics, wrote poetry in Chinese following Tang conventions, collected Chinese paintings and calligraphy, dressed in Chinese-style robes, and performed music on instruments imported from the continent. Knowledge of Chinese literature became essential to court life, the mark distinguishing the cultivated from the provincial. Yet something curious was happening beneath this surface signification. Japanese poets writing in Chinese began introducing native sensibilities, seasonal references particular to the archipelago, emotional tones that felt subtly different from continental models. The Manyoshu, a massive anthology of poetry compiled in the late 8th century, preserved works in Japanese using Chinese characters phonetically to represent Japanese sounds, creating a hybrid writing system that captured native linguistic rhythms. The state's administrative machinery was finding its rhythm as well, though never quite matching the Chinese ideal. Provincial governors ventured into the countryside, conducting censuses, registering land, collecting taxes in rice, textiles, and corvée labor. Official roads connected Nara to the provinces, and along these roads traveled not just tax collectors, but monks, merchants, itinerant craftsmen, spreading continental culture beyond the capital. Regional temples served as outposts of literacy and learning. Local elites sent their sons to study in Nara, hoping connections forged at court would benefit family fortunes back home. A national identity was slowly crystallizing, not replacing regional loyalties but overlaying them, creating a sense that participation in this larger project, this deliberate construction of civilized society, mattered beyond immediate clan interests. The archipelago was building its reputation, proving it could master continental learning while maintaining distinctive character. Foreign envoys visiting Nara reported back to Chinese and Korean courts that Japan, once dismissed as a backward frontier, had constructed an impressive capital, sponsored magnificent Buddhist institutions, and developed sophisticated administrative systems. This mattered. In the hierarchical worldview of East Asian diplomacy, Japan was climbing the ladder of civilization, earning respect through cultural achievement rather than military might. The islands were no longer peripheral, no longer content to absorb continental influence passively. They were becoming a civilization in their own right, ready to stand alongside Korea and even China as a mature participant in East Asian culture. The long apprenticeship was bearing fruit. But this was only the beginning of a journey that would test the resilience of Japanese institutions and the depth of cultural transformation. As the 8th century drew toward its close, the very success of the Nara period began revealing profound challenges. The Buddhist establishment had grown too powerful, too entangled with temporal authority. The great temples controlled vast estates exempt from taxation, commanded private armies of warrior monks, and exercised influence over imperial succession. The capital itself had become crowded, unhealthy, its wood frame buildings vulnerable to the fires that regularly swept through urban neighborhoods. And perhaps most troubling, The centralized bureaucratic state that reforms had attempted to create was showing signs of fragility, its Chinese-inspired structures poorly suited to Japanese social realities. The Fujiwara clan exemplified both the achievements and contradictions of this era. Descended from Nakatomi no Kamatari, the ally who had helped Prince Naka no Oe execute the Soga coup, the Fujiwara had positioned themselves as indispensable servants of the imperial house. They mastered the new bureaucratic system, accumulating the highest court ranks, dominating the most important ministerial positions. But their real genius lay in a strategy that would define Japanese politics for centuries. They married their daughters to emperors and princes, ensuring that imperial consorts, and therefore future emperors, carried Fujiwara blood. This created a permanent relationship of dependence, where emperors relied on Fujiwara relatives and in-laws to manage the government, while the Fujiwara derived their power from proximity to the throne. This was influence without usurpation, power exercised through indirection rather than direct rule. The Fujiwara never claimed the throne for themselves, understanding that the imperial line's sacred character was the very source of legitimate authority they sought to control. Better to rule through emperors than replace them, to exercise real power while allowing sovereigns to maintain ceremonial dignity. It was a sophisticated political arrangement that preserved traditional legitimacy while adapting to new realities, very Japanese in its emphasis on form, hierarchy, and indirect relationships. Yet it also meant that the meritocratic bureaucracy envisioned by reformers would never fully materialize. Birth, connection, and family strategy mattered more than any examination system could counterbalance. Meanwhile, at the empire's margins, different challenges emerged. The northern frontier remained unconquered, inhabited by the Emishi people, descendants of Jomon populations who had never accepted Yamato authority. Through the 8th century, Japanese expansion crept northward, military colonies established beyond the old boundaries, fortresses built to protect settlers, and overawe indigenous resistance. But the Emishi fought back, guerrilla campaigns that frustrated imperial forces and drained treasury resources. The Japanese eventually prevailed through attrition and overwhelming force, but at considerable cost, and the experience revealed limits to centralized power. Distance and terrain constrained what the state could achieve, how far authority could project from the capital. In 784, Emperor Kamu made a decisive break with the Nara era, relocating the capital to Nagaoka, then 10 years later to Heian-kyo, modern Kyoto. The reasons were multiple and complex. Escaping Buddhist institutional power certainly mattered. The great Nara temples had become too wealthy and politically involved to ignore, and moving the capital meant leaving them behind, reducing their influence through simple geography. But there were other motivations as well: geomantic considerations about finding a more auspicious site, desire to assert imperial authority through grand construction projects, political maneuvering related to succession disputes and ministerial rivalries. Whatever the precise mix of motives, the result was clear: a new capital, designed like Nara on a Chinese grid pattern, but more spacious, more carefully planned, built in a valley surrounded by mountains that provided natural defenses and agreeable climate. Heian-kyo would remain Japan's capital for more than 1,000 years, giving its name to an entire epoch, the Heian period, spanning from 794 to 1185. The move represented both continuity and change. Continuity because the new capital perpetuated the Chinese-inspired model of urban planning and bureaucratic administration that Nara had established. Change because moving the capital acknowledged that the Nara system had reached its limits. That adjustment was necessary to maintain the project of civilized governance. It was recognition that cultural transformation was never complete, that each generation faced new challenges requiring creative adaptation rather than rigid adherence to imported models. The challenges confronting the early Heian court were formidable. how to maintain central authority when provincial strongmen increasingly ignored edicts from the capital, how to fund government operations when the land allocation system was breaking down, when powerful families were accumulating private estates exempt from taxation, how to balance continental cultural influence against emerging native aesthetic sensibilities, how to preserve imperial prestige when real power increasingly belonged to the Fujiwara regents. These questions had no easy answers, and the solutions that emerged would transform Japanese civilization in ways the 8th century reformers could never have imagined. The early challenges were revealing that borrowed institutions, however sophisticated, could not simply be transplanted without profound modifications reflecting local conditions, native traditions, and the accumulated experience of attempting to govern a realm very different from the Chinese Empire that had inspired Japan's institutional framework. The easy phase of cultural borrowing was ending. Now came the harder work of creative synthesis. In the annals of history, few moments shine as bright as the cultural flowering that unfolded in Heian-kyo during the 9th and 10th centuries. What began as a deliberate attempt to replicate Chinese sophistication gradually transformed into something unprecedented, a distinctly Japanese aesthetic sensibility that would define the civilization for centuries to come. The court aristocracy, freed from the immediate pressures of state building and military expansion, turned their considerable energies toward refined pursuits, toward poetry, calligraphy, music, and the subtle art of social performance. This was Japan's golden age of court culture, when beauty itself became a form of spiritual practice, when aesthetic discrimination marked one's status as surely as rank or lineage. The Japanese language itself underwent revolution. For generations, the elite had written in Chinese, using that language for all serious communication, official documents, historical chronicles, and philosophical treatises. Japanese existed primarily as spoken tongue, occasionally recorded phonetically using Chinese characters in cumbersome ways. But during the 9th century, women at court, excluded from the formal Chinese education their male relatives received, began developing a streamlined writing system that captured Japanese sounds elegantly and efficiently. These syllabic scripts, hiragana and katakana, liberated Japanese from dependence on Chinese characters for phonetic representation. Suddenly it became possible to write naturally, fluidly in one's native language, and this breakthrough unleashed extraordinary literary creativity. The masterwork of this transformation was the tale of Genji. Written around the year 1010 by Murasaki Shikibu, a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court. This vast prose narrative, following the life and romantic adventures of the shining prince Genji across 54 chapters, created what many scholars consider the world's first true novel. Not epic poetry, not chronicle or myth, but psychological fiction exploring the inner lives of characters with unprecedented depth and sophistication. Murasaki's prose captured the emotional textures of court life with extraordinary sensitivity, the aesthetic appreciation of cherry blossoms falling or autumn leaves turning, the melancholy awareness of time's passage, the complex dance of courtship governed by elaborate protocols. Reading Genji was to enter a world where poetry determined social success, where the choice of paper for a love letter mattered as much as its contents, where beauty and sorrow intertwined inseparably. But Genji was not alone. The Heian period produced a remarkable body of literature, much of it by women writing in Japanese, while men continued composing in Chinese. The Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon, a contemporary of Murasaki, offered witty, sharp observations about court life, lists of beautiful things and hateful things, amusing anecdotes and cutting character portraits. The Kokinshu, an imperially commissioned poetry anthology compiled around 905, established aesthetic principles that would guide Japanese poetry for centuries, emphasizing emotional subtlety, seasonal awareness, and the beauty of suggestion over explicit statement. These works collectively define Japanese aesthetic consciousness, creating what we might call the emotional vocabulary of the civilization. The concept of mono-no-aware, the poignant awareness of impermanence, emerged as a central aesthetic principle during this period. Everything beautiful was temporary. Cherry blossoms fell within days of blooming. Autumn leaves blazed briefly before winter winds scattered them. Human beauty faded. Love affairs ended. Life itself was fleeting. This awareness did not lead to despair, but to heightened appreciation, a sense that beauty's very transience made it more precious, more worthy of attention and remembrance. To experience mono-no-aware was to be moved by this poignancy, to feel the bittersweet emotional resonance of impermanent beauty. It represented a distinctly Japanese sensibility, influenced by Buddhism's teachings about impermanence, but transformed into aesthetic principle rather than religious doctrine. The visual arts flourished as well, developing characteristics that would become recognizably Japanese. Yamato-e, Japanese-style painting, emerged as a distinct tradition separate from Chinese models. These paintings depicted seasonal landscapes of the Japanese archipelago, illustrated scenes from classical literature, captured the architecture and fashions of court life. The colors were rich, the compositions asymmetrical, the perspective flattened in ways that emphasized decorative beauty over realistic representation. Calligraphy became an art form of supreme importance, the way one wrote considered as significant as what one wrote. A courtier's skill with brush and ink revealed cultivation, taste, spiritual refinement. The great calligraphers were celebrated, their works treasured like paintings. Meanwhile, religious life was evolving in unexpected directions. Two monks, Saicho and Kukai, traveled to China in the early 9th century and returned with new forms of Buddhism that would transform Japanese religious consciousness. Saicho established Tendai Buddhism on Mount Hiei near Kyoto, while Kukai founded Shingon Buddhism at Mount Koya. Both traditions emphasized esoteric practices, ritual complexity, and the possibility of achieving enlightenment in this very lifetime through proper training. Their monasteries became centers of learning and spiritual power, training grounds for generations of monks who would shape Japanese Buddhism. Yet these Buddhist developments coexisted peacefully with Shinto, creating the syncretic religious landscape that characterized Japan, where one might pray to Shinto kami for worldly benefits and turn to Buddhist philosophy for understanding death and suffering, the Heian. Achievement was establishing distinctly Japanese culture while maintaining sophisticated engagement with continental learning. The court still sent occasional embassies to China, still revered Chinese classics, still organized itself according to Chinese-inspired bureaucratic principles. But increasingly, Japanese intellectuals felt confident making their own aesthetic and philosophical choices, adapting foreign models rather than slavishly copying them. This was civilization maturity, the confidence to synthesize rather than merely absorb, to create rather than imitate. The long apprenticeship to continental culture had produced something new, something that could stand on its own terms. Japan had found its cultural voice, and that voice would echo through centuries. Yet beneath this apparent cultural triumph, the political foundations were shifting in ways that would ultimately undermine the centralized state the 8th century reformers had labored to create. The land allocation system that was supposed to fund the government through taxes on state-owned paddies was collapsing under its own contradictions. Powerful families, temples, and aristocrats had discovered legal mechanisms to claim permanent, tax-exempt ownership of agricultural land, creating private estates called shuan. These estates proliferated throughout the countryside, gradually replacing the public domain with a patchwork of private holdings, whose owners owed no taxes to the central government and recognized no authority beyond their own interests. The Shun system represented the reassertion of private power against state authority, the revenge of the old clan-based order against Chinese-inspired centralization. It began innocuously enough, the government granting tax exemptions to reward loyal supporters, or to encourage development of marginal land. Buddhist temples received grants to support their religious activities. High-ranking nobles obtained estates as perquisites of office. But once the precedent was established, it spread like wildfire. Provincial strongmen commended their lands to powerful aristocrats or temples in the capital, gaining protection from provincial governors in exchange for sharing revenues. The commended lands became nominally part of larger estates, adding to the tax-exempt portfolio of capital-based patrons while leaving actual management in local hands. The consequences were profound and far-reaching. As more land moved into private estates, the tax base supporting government operations shrank steadily. Provincial governors found their authority eroding, unable to tax lands claimed by powerful patrons in the capital, unable to conscript labor or military service from estate residents who answered to private masters. The carefully constructed bureaucratic system lost its material foundation, became increasingly ceremonial rather than functional. Real power shifted from government offices to private estate networks, from public institutions to personal relationships between patrons and clients. The Chinese model was being hollowed out from within, not through conscious rejection, but through thousands of individual decisions by families seeking to protect their wealth and privilege. The Fujiwara clan mastered this new reality better than anyone. By the 10th century, they had perfected their strategy of marrying daughters to emperors, ensuring that each successive sovereign had Fujiwara maternal relatives. The position of Kampaku, or regent, became hereditary within the senior Fujiwara line, allowing them to rule in the emperor's name regardless of the sovereign's age or competence. Fujiwara no Michinaga, who dominated court politics from 995 to 1027, reached the pinnacle of this system, seeing 4 of his daughters become imperial consorts and 3 of his grandsons ascend the throne. "This world," he wrote in a famous poem, "I think is indeed my world, like the full moon I watch, there is nothing to bemoan." Michinaga's confidence was not misplaced. The Fujiwara had achieved what the Soga clan had attempted and failed to do centuries earlier. They had made themselves indispensable to imperial rule while respecting the formal boundaries of imperial sovereignty. They never claimed the throne, understanding that their power derived precisely from serving as intermediaries, as the practical administrators who made imperial government function. Emperors reigned, performed rituals, provided sacred legitimacy, but the Fujiwara governed, appointed officials, managed estates, accumulated wealth that dwarfed imperial revenues. It was a shadow government, power exercised through influence rather than office, through private relationships rather than public authority. This period also witnessed the development of cultural practices that would define Japanese civilization for centuries to come. The tea ceremony, though not yet formalized, began emerging from the simple act of drinking tea into an elaborate aesthetic ritual. The appreciation of gardens, not as utilitarian vegetable plots but as composed landscapes meant to inspire contemplation, became an aristocratic obsession. The architectural style of Shinden-zukuri, with its interconnected pavilions linked by corridors, its integration with surrounding gardens, its refined simplicity and natural materials, established aesthetic principles that would influence Japanese architecture ever after. Court dress became more elaborately regulated, with colors, patterns, and layering prescribed according to season, occasion, and rank. Yet for all its cultural refinement, Heian civilization was developing a fatal weakness. The capital aristocrats, absorbed in aesthetic pursuits and political maneuvering, were losing touch with the provinces, with the military realities that ultimately determined who held power. As the government's provincial authority weakened, local strongmen increasingly relied on private warriors to protect their interests, to enforce their claims, to settle disputes that the distant capital could not or would not address. These warriors, samurai as they would come to be called, initially ranked far below courtiers in social prestige. They were provincials, men who worked with their hands and bodies, who knew horses and weapons rather than poetry and calligraphy. The aristocrats regarded them with disdain as crude but occasionally useful instruments. This attitude would prove disastrously short-sighted. While the court aristocrats wrote poetry and planned costume for seasonal festivals, military power was coalescing in provincial warrior bands led by branches of the imperial family and major aristocratic houses that had been pushed out to the countryside. The Taira and Minamoto clans, both descended from imperial princes, were establishing themselves as preeminent military powers, building networks of vassal warriors, gaining experience in frontier campaigns against the Emishi in the north and pirates in the inland sea. They were becoming a separate class, with their own values emphasizing martial virtue, loyalty to one's lord, and personal honor. The defining moment was approaching when these provincial warriors would look toward the capital and recognize that the refined aristocrats who despised them controlled wealth and status but had forgotten how to fight. Power, these warriors would discover, ultimately belonged to those willing and able to use force. The Heian world, for all its cultural brilliance, was built on foundations that were slowly crumbling. And so the wheel of fortune turned, bringing Heian culture to its apogee, even as the political structure supporting it showed signs of terminal decay. The 11th century represented the high point of aristocratic refinement, when aesthetic cultivation reached heights perhaps never surpassed in any civilization. The court had become a theater where every gesture carried meaning, where one's choice of poem to accompany a flower arrangement could make or ruin a reputation, where courtship proceeded through elaborate exchanges of calligraphy and verse that might continue for months before any direct meeting occurred. To the aristocrats living this life, absorbed in its intricate protocols and aesthetic judgments, it must have seemed eternal, the natural order of things, a way of life that would continue indefinitely. The international context reinforced this sense of security and accomplishment. Japan had largely withdrawn from direct engagement with China. The official embassy system that had brought students and monks to the Tang capital had been suspended in 894, deemed no longer necessary. This was not isolation, but confident maturity, a sense that Japan had absorbed what it needed from continental civilization and could now develop according to its own genius. When news arrived of the Tang dynasty's collapse in 907, followed by decades of disunity in China, it confirmed Japanese aristocrats in their belief that they had successfully created a stable, civilized society while the continent descended into chaos. The Chinese model that had inspired the Nara reforms was no longer relevant. Japan's development would henceforth be indigenous. The Fujiwara Regency reached its zenith during this period, but paradoxically, the very success of their political dominance created problems they could not solve. By concentrating power so thoroughly in their own hands, by reducing emperors to ceremonial figureheads, the Fujiwara removed any check on their own factional disputes. Different branches of the family competed for the regency, the Kampaku position that conferred control over government. Their rivalries destabilized the court, created uncertainty about succession, and gradually revealed that the Fujiwara monopoly on power had become a vulnerability rather than strength. If their unity fractured, there was no institutional structure to maintain order. In 1068, Emperor Go-Sanjo ascended the throne, the first emperor in a century whose mother was not a Fujiwara. This seemingly minor detail had profound implications. Go-Sanjo was not beholden to the Fujiwara in the way his predecessors had been, and he used his relative independence to attempt reforms, trying to recover imperial authority that had been ceded to the regents. His son, Emperor Shirakawa, went further, abdicating in 1086 but continuing to exercise power from retirement, creating what historians call cloistered government, or insei. These retired emperors, free from ceremonial obligations, could act more decisively than reigning sovereigns, and for several decades they successfully contested Fujiwara dominance, building their own networks of estates and warrior supporters. This political maneuvering at the capital had unintended consequences in the provinces, where the distinction between civilian government and military power was breaking down entirely. The warrior class, previously despised as provincial rustics, was becoming indispensable to anyone seeking to protect estates, enforce claims, or project power beyond the capital's immediate environs. The great warrior clans, especially the Taira and Minamoto, were increasingly drawn into capital politics, recruited as muscle by competing factions of aristocrats and retired emperors. What these aristocrats failed to understand was that once warriors entered the political arena, once military force became the arbiter of disputes, the old cultural capital that had sustained aristocratic dominance would count for little. The apogee of Heian culture was thus also its beginning of its end. The tale of Genji captured a world already passing even as Murasaki Shikibu wrote about it. The ceremonies and aesthetic practices she described so lovingly were reaching their fullest elaboration precisely as the material and political foundations supporting them eroded. The Shun system had drained resources from central government. The aristocracy had become so removed from practical administration that they could no longer govern effectively even when they wished to. The warriors despised by courtiers were the only force capable of enforcing decisions or maintaining order. And in the provinces, far from the capital's refined atmosphere, a different culture was emerging, one that valued martial prowess over poetic skill, loyalty over aesthetic discrimination, action over contemplation. Recognition of Heian culture's achievement would come largely in retrospect, as later generations looked back on this era with nostalgia and longing. The aesthetic principles established during these centuries, the literary works produced, the architectural styles perfected, would become touchstones of Japanese civilization, reference points that defined cultural authenticity. Even as political and military power shifted decisively away from the court aristocracy, even as warriors replaced courtiers as the dominant class, the cultural prestige of Heian refinement endured. Future shoguns and daimyo would patronize poets and calligraphers, would study classical literature, would attempt to appropriate the cultural legitimacy that court aristocrats had monopolized. The Heian achievement was establishing a cultural ideal powerful enough to outlive the political system that produced it. The apex had been reached, that perfect moment when cultural sophistication and political stability seemed to align, when Japan had successfully created a distinctive civilization drawing on continental learning but expressing uniquely Japanese sensibilities. Yet history whispers that peaks are followed by descents. That concentration of power breeds vulnerability, that military force, however refined culture may pretend to transcend it, ultimately determines political outcomes. The refined world of the Heian court, so confident in its own permanence, was about to discover that beauty and cultivation, however sophisticated, could not defend themselves against men who knew how to fight. The age of the warrior was approaching, and with it, the collapse of everything the aristocrats had built. Meanwhile, forces beyond anyone's control were gathering in the provinces, where the distinction between protection and conquest had grown perilously thin. The year 1156 brought violence into the capital itself, shattering the illusion that refined culture could somehow exist apart from military realities. The Hogan Rebellion erupted from a succession dispute. Rival factions of the imperial family and Fujiwara clan, each summoning warrior allies to press their claims. For 3 days, armed men clashed in the streets of Kyoto, setting fires, besieging aristocratic mansions, treating the sacred capital as if it were any provincial battlefield. When the fighting ended, precedent had been shattered irreparably. Warriors had killed imperial princes and high-ranking nobles. Military force had determined political succession. The sanctity that had protected the capital the assumption that aesthetic refinement somehow transcended violence, lay in ruins. The Taira clan emerged victorious from these conflicts, their leader, Taira no Kiyomori, proving himself both skilled warrior and shrewd politician. He understood that military dominance alone was insufficient, that legitimacy still flowed from the imperial institution and the cultural prestige of the court aristocracy. Rather than overthrowing the existing order, Kiyomori inserted himself into it, marrying his daughter to the emperor, accumulating court ranks and ministerial positions, building a network of estates that made the Taira wealthier than the Fujiwara had ever been. In 1167, he became Grand Minister, the highest position in the government bureaucracy, the first warrior to reach such heights. The Taira were attempting what the Fujiwara had accomplished, dominating the system from within rather than replacing it. But with one crucial difference: their power rested on military force rather than cultural capital and marriage politics alone. Yet Kiyomori's success bred resentment among rival warrior clans, particularly the Minamoto, who had supported the losing side in earlier conflicts and seen their leaders executed or exiled. The Minamoto remembered their own glory days, when they had dominated eastern provinces and commanded respect as preeminent warriors. Now they chafed under Taira supremacy, plotted revenge, and waited for opportunity. It came in 1180 when Prince Mochihito, passed over for imperial succession, issued a call for warriors to rise against the Taira. Though the prince himself was quickly killed, his summons triggered rebellion across the eastern provinces, where Minamoto loyalists seized upon this excuse to challenge Taira dominance. The Genpei War, as it came to be known, raged for 5 years, devastating the countryside and revealing the utter collapse of civilian government authority. This was no longer a dispute between court factions hiring warriors to settle succession questions. This was warriors fighting warriors for supremacy, with the imperial institution and court aristocracy reduced to pawns in their struggle. The campaigns swept back and forth across the archipelago, from the northern provinces where Minamoto no Yoritomo established his base, to the inland sea where naval battles determined control of strategic waterways, to the western regions where the Taira retreated as Minamoto forces pressed them relentlessly. The conflict produced legends that would echo through Japanese culture for centuries. The young warrior Minamoto no Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's half-brother, became renowned for brilliant tactics and personal courage, his victories at Ichinotani and Yashima turning the war's momentum decisively against the Taira. The warrior monk, Benkei, supposedly defeated by Yoshitsune in single combat and thereafter serving him with absolute loyalty, epitomized the samurai ideal of faithful service unto death. The Taira were depicted as sophisticated but effete, corrupted by wealth and court luxury, having forgotten the warrior virtues that originally brought them to power. These narratives simplified complex realities, but captured something true about the conflict, a sense that the Heian world's refinement had become weakness, that survival required harder virtues than aesthetic cultivation. The war culminated in 1185 at the naval battle of Dan no Ura, where the Minamoto fleet trapped the Taira in the narrow straits between Honshu and Kyushu. The battle became slaughter, Taira ships overwhelmed, warriors leaping into the sea rather than face capture. Kiyomori's widow, holding the child emperor Antoku in her arms, jumped into the waves, drowning them both rather than surrendering to enemies. The Taira were destroyed, not merely defeated but nearly exterminated as a political force. The imperial regalia, the sacred sword, mirror, and jewels that legitimized sovereignty disappeared into the depths, though the mirror and jewel were eventually recovered. The sword, so legends claimed, remained beneath the waves, swallowed by the sea goddess, a portent of the upheavals that would follow. The Genpei War marked the definitive end of the Heian era's political order. The court aristocracy, having relied on warriors to settle their disputes, discovered they had summoned forces they could not control. The cultural refinement that had seemed civilization's highest achievement now appeared irrelevant, even contemptible, to men whose authority rested on military prowess. The capital itself, which had escaped significant warfare for centuries, had been burned and occupied multiple times during the conflict. The Shun system that had enriched aristocrats and temples had funded warrior armies that owed loyalty to military lords rather than civil institutions. Everything the 8th century reformers had built, the Chinese-inspired centralized state, the court bureaucracy, the civilian dominance over military affairs, had collapsed into warlordism and endemic violence. The controversies and conflicts had revealed that high-end civilization, for all its cultural brilliance, lacked the institutional resilience to survive determined military challenge. The wheel of fortune had turned completely, and the age of the warrior had irrevocably arrived. As the years unfolded like pages in a scroll stained with blood and ash, the victorious Minamoto clan faced the challenge of transforming military supremacy into lasting political order. Minamoto no Yoritomo, the methodical strategist who had coordinated the anti-Taira campaign from his base in Kamakura, far from Kyoto's corrupting influence, understood that repeating the Taira mistake was fatal. Kiyomori had sought prestige and legitimacy through court ranks and capital residence, had allowed himself to be absorbed into the aristocratic world he nominally dominated, and this had been his undoing. Yoritomo would take a different path, maintaining physical and psychological distance from the court, building a separate administrative structure answerable only to military authority, creating what would become a parallel government that ruled Japan while leaving the imperial court formally intact but politically impotent. In 1192, Yoritomo received the title of shogun generalissimo, nominally a temporary military appointment, but in practice the foundation of a new political order. He established his headquarters in Kamakura, a small coastal town surrounded by mountains, easily defended, its very remoteness from Kyoto a statement of independence. The Bakufu, or tent government as warrior administration was called, was not replacing the imperial court but superseding it, creating dual authority where the emperor reigned but the shogun ruled. This arrangement would define Japanese politics for nearly 7 centuries, until the Meiji Restoration of 1868 finally abolished the shogunate and restored practical power to the imperial institution, yet personal struggles undermined Yoritomo's political achievement almost immediately. His relationship with his brilliant half-brother Yoshitsune, the tactical genius whose victories had won the war, deteriorated into paranoid suspicion. Yoritomo feared Yoshitsune's popularity among warriors, saw rivalry where perhaps none existed, and drove his brother into exile and ultimately to death. Yoshitsune's tragic fate, hunted and finally cornered, committing ritual suicide rather than surrendering to his brother's forces, became one of Japanese history's most poignant tales, embodying themes of loyalty betrayed, genius unrecognized, and the cruel necessities of political survival. The warrior culture celebrated loyalty unto death, yet its first great shogun had destroyed the very brother who ensured his triumph. Yoritomo himself died in 1199, thrown from his horse under circumstances that remain mysterious, and the Minamoto line that had fought so hard for supremacy barely survived him. His sons proved weak or died young, and real power passed to his widow's family, the Hojo clan, who took the title of regent to the shogun, just as the Fujiwara had been regents to emperors. The irony was profound and bitter. Warriors had overthrown aristocratic dominance, had created a government based on military service and feudal loyalty rather than cultural refinement and bureaucratic rank. Yet within a generation, they had recreated the very pattern of indirect rule they had displaced. The Hojo regents controlled shoguns who nominally commanded warriors in the name of emperors who possessed sacred authority but no practical power. It was authority mediated through multiple layers of formal subordination masking actual dominance, very Japanese in its complexity and indirection. The early 13th century tested these new political arrangements severely. In the capital, retired Emperor Go-Toba, humiliated by his powerlessness, attempted to overthrow the shogunate in 1221, rallying warriors to the imperial cause and issuing edicts commanding Hojo overthrow. The Jokyu disturbance, as this conflict became known, ended in catastrophic failure for the court. The Hojo mobilized overwhelming force, marched on Kyoto, defeated imperial forces decisively, and for the first time in history, exiled a retired emperor to a remote island. The message was unmistakable. Military power trumped sacred authority. Warriors would tolerate the imperial institution only so long as it remained ceremonial and compliant. The court's prestige never recovered from this humiliation, its political irrelevance confirmed for centuries to come. Meanwhile, the warrior class was developing its own cultural identity, distinct from and implicitly critical of aristocratic refinement. The ideals of Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasized martial prowess, absolute loyalty to one's lord, indifference to death, and simplicity of life. Where aristocrats valued aesthetic discrimination and emotional sensitivity, warriors celebrated stoic endurance and decisive action. Where court culture found beauty in elegant verse and refined ceremony, warrior culture admired directness, physical courage, and practical competence. Buddhism adapted to warrior sensibilities through Zen, emphasizing meditation and self-discipline over elaborate ritual, mental clarity over textual study, the possibility of sudden enlightenment through direct intuition rather than gradual cultivation. Yet for all this cultural differentiation, warriors remained strangely deferential toward traditional aristocratic prestige. Shoguns and their retainers sought court ranks and titles, patronized classical literature, studied the aesthetic traditions they supposedly despised. The Heian cultural achievement retained enormous prestige even as its political foundations had collapsed entirely. It was as if military rulers recognized that force alone could not provide legitimacy, that cultural sophistication remained necessary to transform raw power into recognized authority. The late period struggles were thus internal as much as external, warriors attempting to define themselves against aristocratic culture while simultaneously appropriating its prestige, creating a hybrid identity that acknowledged both martial necessity and cultural aspiration. The personal struggles of this era revealed a civilization in painful transition, caught between competing value systems, unable to fully embrace either aristocratic refinement or pure military pragmatism. The elegant world described in the tale of Genji had not disappeared, but had been relegated to increasingly irrelevant ceremonial functions. Warriors ruled but felt culturally inferior to the aristocrats they dominated. The imperial institution retained sacred character but exercised no practical authority. It was an unstable synthesis, contradictions papered over by elaborate protocols and indirect rule that satisfied form while acknowledging reality. These tensions would persist for centuries, shaping Japanese political culture in ways both productive and problematic. There is something deeply moving about civilizations confronting forces they cannot comprehend or control. And in the mid-13th century, Japan faced precisely such an existential challenge. In 1274, Mongol armies appeared off the coast of Kyushu, the first foreign invasion attempt in recorded Japanese history. Kublai Khan, having conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, having subjugated Korea and turned it into a tributary state, now demanded Japan's submission. When the shogunate refused, the Mongols came with overwhelming force. Hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of warriors, equipped with gunpowder weapons, massed archery tactics, and military organization on a scale Japanese warriors had never encountered. The samurai defenders, accustomed to individual combat governed by codes of honor, found themselves facing coordinated units employing unfamiliar tactics. Mongol warriors fought in disciplined formations, used explosive projectiles that terrified horses and men alike, seemed indifferent to the single combat challenges that were supposed to precede battles. The Japanese defenders, despite their courage and desperate determination, were being pushed back along the coast when fortune intervened. A great storm arose, scattering the Mongol fleet, sinking ships, drowning thousands. The invaders withdrew to Korea, and Japan had survived, though more through luck than military superiority. 7 years later, in 1281, the Mongols returned with an even larger force, perhaps the largest amphibious invasion fleet assembled until the modern era. They established beachheads, prepared for extended campaign, seemed poised to succeed where the first attempt had failed. The Japanese defenders had used the intervening years to construct defensive walls along vulnerable coastlines, to organize resistance more effectively, but they remained badly outnumbered and technologically outmatched. And then, as if the gods themselves intervened, another massive typhoon struck, destroying much of the Mongol fleet, ending the invasion attempt catastrophically. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, divine winds, confirmation that their islands enjoyed supernatural protection, that the kami would defend Japan against foreign conquest. The immediate military crisis had passed, but its psychological and economic impacts reverberated for decades. The Kamakura shogunate had mobilized resources on unprecedented scale to meet the Mongol threat, had promised rewards to warriors who defended the homeland, but victory brought no territorial conquests, no wealth to distribute to compensate those who had fought. Warriors who had bankrupted themselves buying equipment and maintaining readiness received little or nothing, their service taken for granted, their sacrifices uncompensated. Resentment festered, loyalty eroded. The feudal bonds that held the warrior system together began fraying under economic strain. The late Kamakura period saw increasing lawlessness, warriors turning to banditry when legitimate rewards failed to materialize, provincial order breaking down as central authority weakened. The Hojo regents, having ruled competently for decades, seemed incapable of addressing mounting crises, unable to reform the land tenure system that was impoverishing lesser warriors, unwilling to acknowledge that the institutional arrangements that had served adequately in peacetime proved inadequate for sustained emergency mobilization. The very success in repelling the Mongols had created problems the regime could not solve, had exposed vulnerabilities it could not address without fundamental reform it lacked the vision or courage to attempt. In 1333, the regime collapsed with stunning rapidity. Emperor Go-Daigo, attempting what Go-Toba had failed a century earlier, issued calls to overthrow the shogunate. This time, disaffected warriors responded. Ashikaga Takauji, a Minamoto descendant serving the Hojo, switched sides, bringing powerful military support to the imperial cause. Within months, the Kamakura shogunate that had ruled Japan for nearly 150 years was destroyed, the Hojo regents dead by their own hands or in battle, their administrative apparatus dismantled. It seemed briefly that imperial rule might be restored, that the anomaly of warrior government might end, that Japan might return to the civilian political order that had existed before the Genpei War. But this was illusion, romanticism disconnected from power realities. Go-Daigo's restoration attempted to revive institutions that had been hollow even before warrior dominance, tried to govern through court aristocrats who had no practical administrative experience, alienated the very warriors whose support had enabled his triumph. Within 3 years, Ashikaga Takauji turned against the emperor, established a rival imperial line, drove Go-Daigo into exile in the southern mountains, and founded a new shogunate in Kyoto. Japan split between northern and southern courts, each claiming legitimacy, and descended into civil war that would last more than half a century. The defeats and setbacks of this era revealed the profound instability of the political order warriors had constructed. Military government had proven effective at consolidating power, less successful at creating institutions that could outlast individual leaders or adapt to changing circumstances. The warrior culture of personal loyalty and feudal obligation, powerful on small scale, scaled poorly to national governance. The dual authority of emperor and shogun, which seemed an elegant compromise allowing warriors to rule while preserving sacred legitimacy, created ambiguities that ambitious leaders could exploit. And perhaps most fundamentally, the warrior class itself was fragmenting, the distinction between great lords and petty retainers widening into unbridgeable gulf, the bonds of loyalty weakening as economic pressures intensified and rewards failed to match service. Ancient Japan, the civilization that had emerged from Stone Age hunter-gatherers, that had absorbed continental learning and created distinctive culture, that had produced literary masterpieces and aesthetic principles of enduring beauty, was entering its darkest period. The next centuries would see almost constant warfare. The country fragmented among competing warlords, central authority all but extinct. The elegant refinement of the Heian court reduced to impoverished ceremony performed by powerless aristocrats. Yet even in this decline, even as institutional structures crumbled and violence became endemic, the cultural achievements of earlier eras endured. Preserved in temples and monasteries, transmitted through artistic lineages, waiting for circumstances when they might again flourish. History remembers the deeds, but we remember the people who created beauty amid chaos, who maintained civilization's flame through centuries of darkness. In the quiet shadows of temples and mountain monasteries, as Japan descended into the chaos that historians would name the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, the final vestiges of ancient Japan's institutional order flickered and died. The 15th and 16th centuries witnessed the complete disintegration of central authority, provincial warlords known as daimyo carving out autonomous domains, owing allegiance to no one, recognizing no law beyond their own power and ambition. The shogunate persisted in name, the Ashikaga shoguns maintaining their court in Kyoto, but their authority extended barely beyond the capital's suburbs. The emperor remained secluded in the palace, performing ancient rituals for a state that no longer existed in any meaningful sense, a living ghost presiding over ceremonies whose political relevance had evaporated centuries earlier. The Onin War, erupting in 1467 over shogunal succession, brought unprecedented destruction to Kyoto itself. For 11 years, rival daimyo armies fought street by street through the capital, reducing the city that had stood for nearly 7 centuries to ash and rubble. The great temples burned, their libraries of irreplaceable manuscripts consumed by flames. Aristocratic mansions that had housed generations of refined culture were looted and demolished. The physical embodiment of Heian civilization, the very architecture and spaces where court culture had flourished, was being systematically destroyed. When the fighting finally exhausted itself without clear victor, Kyoto lay in ruins, its population scattered to the provinces, carrying with them fragments of the culture they had lost, spreading aristocratic arts to provincial centers that had previously seemed hopelessly backward. Yet beneath this apparent civilizational collapse, something remarkable was happening. The dispersal of capital-based culture into the provinces democratized refinement that had once been exclusive aristocratic privilege. Tea ceremony, flower arrangement, garden design, poetry composition – these arts found new patrons among wealthy merchants and ambitious daimyo seeking cultural legitimacy to complement military power. Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on simplicity and direct experience, provided philosophical framework for this provincial cultural flowering. The wabi-sabi aesthetic, finding beauty in imperfection and impermanence, in rustic simplicity and natural decay, emerged as distinctly Japanese sensibility, different from both Chinese elegance and Heian courtly refinement, suited to an age when nothing lasted, when destruction was constant, when pretensions to permanence seemed absurd, the provincial warlords themselves were transforming from crude military strongmen into sophisticated rulers. They built castle towns as administrative centers, encouraged commerce and agriculture to fund their armies, patronized cultural pursuits to demonstrate their civilization. Some, like the Imagawa of Suruga, created legal codes and administrative systems remarkably sophisticated given the chaotic times. Others collected art, sponsored tea masters, studied classical literature. They were simultaneously destroyers and preservers, their warfare devastating the countryside, while their cultural patronage sustained traditions that might otherwise have perished. It was as if the centrifugal forces that shattered political unity simultaneously distributed cultural capital that had been monopolized too long by capital elites. The arrival of Europeans in the 1540s added new dimensions to this tumultuous era. Portuguese traders brought firearms, weapons that revolutionized warfare by making individual martial prowess less decisive than disciplined infantry formations equipped with guns. Jesuit missionaries brought Christianity, which attracted tens of thousands of converts, including some daimyo who saw religious conversion as pathway to trading privileges and military technology. European maps revealed Japan's place in a wider world, no longer the center of a Sino-centric cultural sphere, but a distant archipelago on the edge of vast oceans. The psychological impact was profound, forcing Japanese elites to reconsider their civilization's place in global context, to recognize that continental Asia no longer represented the totality of sophisticated culture. By the late 16th century, powerful warlords were emerging who possessed both military strength and administrative vision sufficient to contemplate national reunification. Oda Nobunaga, a relatively minor daimyo from Owari province, began systematically conquering rivals, employing firearms with ruthless efficiency, showing no respect for traditional authority, burning the great monasteries of Mount Hiei when monks opposed him, deposing shoguns who crossed him, treating the emperor with perfunctory respect while making clear that power belonged to whoever could seize and hold it. His assassination in 1582 prevented him from completing reunification, but his successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a peasant-born general who rose through pure ability, continued the work. Hideyoshi achieved what centuries of shoguns had not: effective control over the entire archipelago, forcing daimyo submission, confiscating weapons from peasants to prevent rebellions, conducting land surveys that established clear boundaries and tax obligations. He was creating a centralized feudal state, military in character but bureaucratically administered, drawing on both warrior traditions and continental administrative models. His invasions of Korea in the 1590s, attempts to conquer Ming China by the indirect route through the peninsula, failed catastrophically but demonstrated Japan's transformed military capabilities. The isolated archipelago that had once trembled before Mongol invasions now projected power abroad, however unsuccessfully. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, his former ally Tokugawa Ieyasu maneuvered to succeed him, defeating rival daimyo coalitions at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. Ieyasu established a new shogunate in Edo, modern Tokyo, that would endure for more than 250 years, finally bringing the violent chaos of the Warring States period to definitive end. But this was no longer ancient Japan. The Tokugawa order was something new, a synthesis of warrior government, Neo-Confucian philosophy, and rigid social control that bore little resemblance to either the Heian court culture or the Kamakura warrior ethos. Ancient Japan, the civilization that had begun with Jomon pottery and continental borrowing, that had created the tale of Genji and established Shinto Buddhist syncretism, had finally expired. Not in a single dramatic moment, but through centuries of gradual transformation. Its institutions hollowed out, its cultural forms preserved but divorced from living political reality. The final years had been long. painful, destructive, yet paradoxically creative, destroying old certainties while preserving and distributing cultural achievements that would define Japanese identity for centuries to come.